And the thing I notice here with housing is that there seems to be this thing that you have to own your own home, and unless you own it, it isn't really your home at all. You are, in effect, on a short tenancy, or you can be pushed around, you can be stigmatised if you're in social housing, ill-treated, and I think this is fundamentally wrong. That is one problem, that only by being an owner-occupier do you have this sort of think that you actually have a home. The second thing is that there's far too much wealth invested in private people's home, as it were. People who have bought houses have accumulated huge amounts of cash wealth, which is not taxed at any point, even when they die, which I think is unbalanced, really. Especially, you know, in London, there are lots of people who bought houses for quite modest amounts who are now millionaires, and yet are not going to be taxed on that. It doesn't strike me as fair, and I just cannot accept the fact that there are so many people without a home at all, and there are another huge number of people. We've got one of the highest proportion of people living in private sector, privately rented accommodation in the country here, living in substandard housing, and they should not be doing that in the 21st century in this rich country. It's just wrong, and it's got to stop. So, yeah.
As an ordinary Labour Party member, what should I do? I think that's my question.
Can I just briefly comment on the earlier question, because I agree with every single word you said. You said it very powerfully and well. But you made your first point, I think, is so important, that being a council tenant is something, you know, below par, infra dig. And it is utterly dreadful, because these people have no option, in most cases, for buying a house. I mean, it's just out of the question. And private rented sector, as you say, is often pretty poor, not to say degraded, with ruthless landlords and very high rents. So council tenancies have a very, very important role. And being a council tenant and living there 30 years and wanting to stay there until you die, what's wrong with that? Why don't we honour council? Why don't we honour tenancies as much as ownership, and particularly council tenancies? But I agree. There is this ideology that's grown up, which the Tories pursue absolutely ruthlessly, that unless you're a private owner, you actually ultimately don't have any real rights. I mean, it is utterly dreadful, and you know, we absolutely should change that. But you need a very powerful, determined government to make that clear. On the question of the Labour Party, and I do agree with Ben that, you know, I'm not here to cultivate support for the Labour Party. I'm here, as I'm sure most of you are, to ensure that most people get their rights and get their entitlements. And I think the Labour Party has a role to play in that, but that's the function. It's not to promote the Labour Party as such. That's a means to an end. Now, housing, I think the debate amongst the so-called leadership contestants has been absolutely putrid. I mean, it's really, it has no real substance. I don't know what any of them really stand for. It's largely coded. We haven't had any serious discussion, any serious issue. Nothing about austerity, nothing, as far as I remember or know, nothing about the economy. And we know, of course, there's a big issue about Europe and Scotland, welfare reform, the Human Rights Act. I mean, all of these are very, very big issues, and they're simply not being mentioned. And I presume in the next few weeks and months that is going to change. And certainly there are going to be people like me, and there are quite a few people like me, who are demanding answers to these questions. And we will have hustings and we will confront them. But at the moment, I agree that if you came down from Mars and looked at the contestants, you, I think, would not be deeply attracted. I mean, they just aren't seriously concentrating on the fundamental issues of this country. And it's all very well to talk about aspiration. I mean, aspiration is a good thing. I mean, people should have the opportunity to aspire to things being better. But you can't achieve that for half the population unless you change the opportunity structures in the country, the fundamental underpinning of the economy, the way society works, the way ideology works, and the attitudes which it has, which are disseminated, throughout society. You have to change those if you are going to, I think, succeed in achieving aspiration. So all I can say is, out of 10, 2 so far, but I hope it creeps up to at least 6 or 7. But we've got a lot of work to do.
My question is there is a lot of work to be done, and it's extremely difficult to prioritise as an individual Labour Party member where your efforts should go. So I sort of, from you as a community campaigner and you, Michael, as a politician, it'd be really interesting to see what you think ordinary Labour Party members could best be focused on at the moment to make a change to society.
I mean, I would kind of have to come back to what Ruth was saying, that, whatever the questions that are brought up by a movement or, a mass movement of people or a political atmosphere, we've got to be prepared for whatever that question is. We need to think realistically that maybe the Labour Party is not going to be the answer. That ultimately we are not committed to an organisation. We are committed to ideals and principles, and we must go where the principles are. And there is a tradition with the Labour Party. There is a long-standing tradition, and it can be, taking on that idea might be difficult for people in this room, but we need to realistically, think about that.
Yeah, more bad news to start with, but just kind of elaborating on the bad news, and then to finish up some good news. Just on the bad news front, just to explain what the new Labour project was in terms of social housing. There wasn't a great deal of municipal building social housing during that time. The expectation was that with private sector development, there would be a quota through the planning system to provide certain levels of affordable housing, usually provided through housing associations, and that worked up to a point. But certainly with the coalition government spending directly on new council housing was cut, and the sales of council houses accelerated. But what people may not be aware of is that through a whole series of incremental stealth moves, the planning system has been recalibrated so that developers can get out of providing affordable housing in almost all instances. And even where they are required to do so, the route of challenging that requirement through demonstrating unviability is open to them, and in many instances that prevails. So the delivery of some affordable housing through the planning system is tailing off, and you need to be aware of that. And it makes the position of councils, and it will make the position of Brighton and Hove City Council even more difficult to deliver the quotas that they're looking for of 30% in new developments. It's going to be even more difficult, and there are whole classes of development now where that need is obviated. It is now written out of the planning system. That's the bad news. Everything is stacked against provision of affordable housing and provision particularly of social housing within that. But there are a number of instances where Labour councils are being very innovative and are attempting to use the system as best they can to deliver. Now, I don't know all the instances, and I'm sure there is networking amongst Labour councils to pass around best practice. But in the likes of Islington, they are using the planning system, or trying to use the planning system to ensure that where No, I'm talking
Oh,
about,
oh,
moving
right,
on,
oh,
moving
right,
on to
sorry.
Enfield. In Islington, they are using the planning system to prevent at least private new development from being used as a speculative tool, simply not housing local people, but being used as an investment by foreign investors and not necessarily being occupied. So trying to use the system to require a certain quota of local residents to be given first priority on occupation. In the likes of Enfield, also in London, there is a kind of backdoor municipalisation programme where they're actually buying up properties and finding that's a very prudent financial measure because the savings they can make on paying housing benefits for private landlords to provide the accommodation. They're also using innovative legal means to ensure that any new council housing that's built, which they're also looking at, borrowing against the assets that they hold as existing council housing, and building through a kind of third sector, third arm enterprise body. So they will be built as council houses, and because they're not directly owned by the council, by another company in their hands, there will not be the right to buy for those properties as well. So there's plenty of examples elsewhere where this necessity is forcing Labour councils to think imaginatively. And I'm sure that best practice will be passed on. It's something the City Council will be interested in, I'm sure.
I agree with land value tax. I also very much agree that the removal of Section 106 in terms of planning is quite serious, and a lot of planners, developers are being let off the hook, which is the bad news. But I also agree with you, and it's happening in Oldham too. And I'm sure, as you say, a lot of quite progressive local authorities are actually managing to find a way round some of the rules and actually innovating in quite helpful ways. I think we should, we're perfectly ready to admit this. This is not entirely a negative discussion, but the situation is pretty negative, and I think we need to face up to it. But it is true that a lot of local authorities are actually handling a very difficult situation quite productively and positively, and we should thank them for that.
Definitely.